Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So some of you guys wanted me to do a crash course on the Yew framework from one of my previous videos. And looking online, I didn't see a lot covering the Yew framework, so I thought why not? I'll make a video on it. I'll try my best to make it as comprehensive as possible, but I'm not super familiar with Yew. I've only used it a couple of times, and Yew is still under heavy development and hasn't reached a 1.0 release yet, so many things are subject to change. But other than that, let's get into it. If you guys found this video useful, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button. This video actually took a bit longer to make just because of all the topics I had to cover, and it took me about 3 or 4 recordings to finish. And consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. So first, some of the prerequisites you would need is Rust and Cargo installed, and probably Python 3 as well for serving web pages. It's also good if you have previous React experience because Yew takes in a lot of principles from React, and I'll be explaining a lot of them using React concepts. And oh yeah, if you guys don't know what Yew is, you can check out my previous video that I'll have in the video description. I'll also be uploading the code onto GitHub for anyone that wants to look at it, and I'll have timestamps in the videos for you guys to quickly access each section. So Yew is actually compatible with multiple different WebAssembly libraries such as Wasm Bindgen, web-sys, and std-web. But for the purpose of this video, I'll just be using whatever's in their documentation, which for the most part is web-sys and Wasm Bindgen. So to get started, we're just going to go on to the Yew documentation website and then go to build a sample app. Inside here, we'll run the command cargo new with our new Yew app. Then we're just going to add the following into our cargo.toml file. Then we're going to add this into our source/lib.rs file. After this, we'll make a static folder where we put our index.html file. And we're going to have the following content inside. So this basically sets up our sample app, and now we can pretty much build it and run it. So first we'll build it using this command. If you don't have Wasm pack installed, you can run cargo install Wasm pack. I already have it installed. And then we can just build our application. Okay, so now that we have our application built, we need to be able to serve our application using a server. Now in the documentation, they tell you to use miniserve, but that requires you to install Rust nightly. So that's going to be a pretty big installation. I like to use Python instead. If we go to Wasm pack, there's a Python command that tells you how to serve your web application using Python. So we'll be using that instead. And we'll be using Python 3, and we'll be setting the root directory to the static directory. So this will serve our web application on localhost 8000. So if we go there now, we'll see our sample Yew application with a button that says +1 and a counter 0, and if we keep pressing it, it's going to increase. So let's go over our lib.rs file and see what exactly is going on. So first we have our struct model. This is basically our component in React. It has 2 fields, a link field and a value field, which I'll get into later. We have a new message. This is what's passed into our component whenever something changes. And then we have our implement component trait for our model. So inside our info block, we have 2 types, message and properties. The message is equal to message, so it basically tells the component what messages it can receive. And then the properties is the prop that you would pass into your component, like in React. So in this case, we're not passing in any properties, so it's just going to be the unit type. Next, we have our create function that creates our component and returns it. Then we have our update method, which takes in a message, and depending on what the message is, we would do something with our component. So in this case, we have message add 1, and it's just going to increment our value by 1 in our component. Next, we have the change method. This gets called when the props of our component changes and we need to do something about it. In this case, we don't have any props, so we're just not going to do anything. So these two functions return true and false and tells you if it needs to be re-rendered or not. Finally, we have our view method. This is basically the render method in React. It's going to return some JSX-like syntax that basically returns the HTML that gets rendered. Inside we have our div, and then inside our div we have a button. And on click, it's going to do a callback function. And this is basically what our link is used for. The callback function is going to take in a function or closure that takes in some sort of event as a parameter, and it's going to return a message depending on what the event was. In this case, it's always going to return add 1, so it's going to increment our value by 1. Then finally, we have our was and bind gen start. This is where Yew starts our application. It's going to initialize our model, and it's going to mount it to the body of our HTML file. So one thing you want to do right away is to increase the recursion limit. So at the beginning of our lib.rs file, we're going to add the following. We're going to set recursion limit equals to 640. You can increase it even higher if you want to, depending on what your use case is. And the reason we want to do this is because in our view method, we use the HTML macro that's provided by Yew, and this macro uses a lot of recursion to process these JSX-like syntax. So if we don't increase our recursion limit, we're going to get errors saying that the maximum recursion depth reached whenever we package our program. Okay, so the first thing I want to explain is the concept of messages, because I think this is probably the most differentiating thing between Yew and React. In that, in React, you can pretty much write whatever you want. You can have a on-click, you write a function that handles the event, and then you just do set state or set something so you can change the state of your component. But in Yew, it's a lot more rigid and unified. Everything has to go through this message enum or whatever enum you specify. So if you have like 4 or 5 fields in your component state and all of them needs to be able to change, then you're going to have probably more than 4 or 5 enum variants that corresponds to each action that the user takes. So for example, in our message, we have the add 1 variant, but what if we also want the user to subtract 1 or multiply by 2 and so on? In that case, we're going to have to add all those variants into our message. So let's say we would add 2 new variants into our message. Of course, we can also combine these into one variant and then have different fields and such. Maybe we have some sort of kind field that tells us if it's addition, subtraction, or multiplication, and then we have a number along with it. Like that. But it just shows you that you have to be a lot more, you basically have to know what your component is going to do beforehand, or you slowly add on to your enum. So let's try that. We'll have a subtract 1. So in our update method, we will need to change it so that it also handles our subtract 1 case. And let's add a new button called subtract 1 that has a callback that returns subtract 1. And now let's build our project again. And if we were to start our server up again, and we go to our web page, we'll see now we have 2 buttons, a +1 and a -1. So the next thing I want to talk about is properties. Properties work very similarly in React and in Yew. Data is passed down from parent to children, and depending on what the properties are, the children is going to behave differently, and it's going to re-render. But to show you this, we're going to create a new component. Let's just call this component the counter for our web page. We'll just copy over the sample app code. So we'll call our component counter. It's not going to have any callbacks or any message passed to it, so we're not going to have a message enum. But what we are going to have is properties. So we're going to create a struct properties. And in order for you to understand that this is a property, we need to use the derive attribute and derive properties. So it's going to derive clone, debug, which are not necessary, but it's nice to have, and we're just going to derive the properties as well. So inside our prop struct, we can declare what we want to be passed into our component. So in this case, we'll just have it's just going to be a count field, and it's going to be of type i64. So now we can get rid of the value in our counter component, and we can add our props instead. For our types, we no longer take in a message, and we take in our prop for our properties. So now for our create function, we're going to take in props. We can remove our update method to just return false. But now if our props change, we need to make sure to update our props and tell Yew to re-render our component. Finally, we'll just display our value. Now in our lib.rs, we'll import our counter component and use it. We need to make sure our counter is public so we can actually access it from our lib.rs, and we can also make our struct public as well. So here, instead of having a paragraph tag and our self.values, we'll just have our counter, and it's going to take an account equal to self.value. Now we're just going to have our counter, and its count property is going to have self.value. We'll save this and run it. Okay, so we need to make sure that our props field is public. So now if we build our application again, and then we run our server, now we have a count, and if we just add 1 and -1, it's just going to act the same as before. And if we were to change the change method in our counter component to return false all the time, then we can see that if we recompile and rerun our application, by clicking on the +1 and -1 buttons, our counter doesn't change visibly because it doesn't get re-rendered. So one thing that's quite common with components is being able to render its children. So this is when you're building your own custom component library or something like that, where you want the user to be able to put components inside your components. So an example would be something like, so here we have kind of like our P component, and then inside we have our H2 component, which is inside our P component. So we want to do something like that. So in React, we have the props.children field, which we use to render the component's children. And we can do the same in Yew as well. All we need to do is add the children field to our props. It's going to be of type yew-children. So now let's get rid of our count and just render our children. So we just do self.props.children. And let's say we want all the children to be colored blue. Something like this. We'll open up our lib.rs file, and instead of passing in our count, we'll just have our paragraph tag like before. But now it's enclosed in our counter component. we'll save this and run it. Okay, so one thing that I forgot to do is you actually need to clone the children. So we'll do that. So in Yew, we actually need to make a copy of the children. This way we still adhere to Rust's ownership and borrowing system. So let's compile it again. And now let's start up our server and refresh our application. You can see now that our counter is blue. But of course, we forgot to change our change method to return true. So let's do that. And let's recompile and start up our server again. And now we can see that the color of the font is blue, and it's also updating whenever we increment or decrement our value. Okay, now let's talk about routing and linking. Just like in React, where you have to import a React router, in Yew, we have to import the yew-router. So let's add that to our cargo.toml file. Now let's create an app router component. And we'll just copy over the template from the sample app. This time we'll also add the yew-router prelude. And then we'll call our component app router. And it's not going to have any fields inside. It's not going to take in any properties or have any messages. And it's never going to update or change. So in React, the routes are defined using strings, but in Rust, the routes are defined using enums, just like how we have enums for messages. So we'll need to create one of those. Now, in order for you to understand that this is a route, it needs to derive the switch attribute. Like this. And then inside we can just specify all the different routes that we have. Let's say we want the index variant, and then maybe 2 other variants, an order and an order list. So in order for you to know how to map URL paths to our route variants, we need to derive the 2 attribute for each of our variants. We can also have URL parameters defined in our paths. Say we want the ID of our order. We can specify ID, and then in our order variant, we just add I64. So one thing to note about this is that Yew checks these URLs from top to bottom. So you always want to put your index at the very bottom, or else it's going to always go to the index variant. So next we'll change our view method. First we'll need to define a render function. This function will be used by our app router to know how to route different URL. It's going to take in a function that takes in our app route, and depending on what it is, it's going to render different pages of our application. So right now we don't have any pages defined, but we'll add them on one by one. And then in our JSX, we'll have we also don't need this function. Okay, so I forgot to move the app router into source, so we did that. Go inside source. So now let's make some pages for our app router to route to. make a pages folder, and we'll go inside that. So let's move our original page to be the home page. We'll get rid of the run app. And then in our lib.rs, we'll just import our app router and render that instead. Now let's make another page called order list. So this one is just going to have some random information in it. Now we need to make a mod.rs file so our app router can see our pages. And just to make it easier, we'll export our home components and our order list component. We'll also move our counter component into a component folder just to make it more organized. We'll also have a mod.rs file for our components as well. Then we'll have to edit our homepage to use the new counter. Okay, so now we can go back to our app router and edit our routes. First, we'll import our pages. So in the case our route is the index variant, we'll render the home page. In the case that it's the order list variant, we'll render the order list page. And for all other cases, we'll just render the home page for now. Now we should be able to rebuild our application. Okay, so I made a few coding mistakes while I was doing this. First, we need to make sure app router is public. I also forgot to change our home component to home instead of being model. And we also need to make sure order list home and the message enum in home is public as well. We also need to get rid of the multiple recursion limits that I had when I copied the files. And we also need to declare our components module and our pages module in our lib.rs file. Okay, so now if we run our server again, you can see we still have our home page like before. But if we try to go to our order list, it's going to give us a 404 not found. And that's because the routing happens on the client side. So we need to add links to our home page to get us to our order list. So let's do that. So in our app router, we're going to declare a new type called link. This is just so it's easier for us to use later on. And it's going to be equal to router anchor app route. So now we've aliased the type called link that pretty much acts the same as the link in React. We also need to make sure that app route is public. Okay, so now let's add links to our homepage. We'll have a route property, and it's going to be our order list. We need to make sure to import these. And then we can also have one for our order later on. And it's going to take in the value of our self.value. Like that. And then we'll recompile. So now if we run our server again, now we have our two links, order list and order 0. And when we increment, our link changes depending on our order. And if we press order 13, it's just going to bring us back to our homepage because we haven't created an order page yet. And if we press order list, it's going to bring us to our order list. And we can go back to go back. So the last thing I wanted to cover is references. So in React, you would use references to directly access or modify elements in the DOM. And it's the same use case in Yew as well. So let's see how we can utilize references by implementing our orders page. This order is going to take in a prop that has the order ID. And it's also going to take in a message for toggling the order details. So for the HTML, we're just going to have a header for the order, and then we'll have a button for showing and displaying the order details. Then let's have some details. So we want to be able to toggle these details on and off. And to do that, we use a reference. So to do that, we're going to add it to our component first. And it's going to be of type node ref. Then we're going to set our diff ref to that ref. And now in our update method, whenever we get our toggle details message, we'll be able to change the display style of our div. Now we can add a CSS file to our HTML and make it so that for the isClosed class, the display is going to be none. Now we'll need to add our order page to our mod.rs file. And we can change our app router to include that as well. I forgot to add a detail ref here to instantiate it. I also accidentally wrote props here when it should be ordered. And we also need to import the web-sys element. So we'll need to add that to our cargo.toml as well. We also need to make sure ID is public in our props struct. Okay, so now if we run our server again, and we go to our order link, we can show and hide the details of our order. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for Yew. If you have any more questions, please leave a comment down below, leave a like, and maybe subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.